I wanted to put this image of the cover of my book up here to begin the talk. Yes, partly for promotional reasons, I confess, but also because I want you to pay attention to a couple things on the cover image. It was not easy to come up with. And there are two really important things to note here. The first is just the title of the book, which is called Going Solo. And for much of the project, when I was doing the research and writing it, the title I was working with was called Alone in America. And I just want you to think about the place that Alone in America as a title takes you to, as opposed to Going Solo. It takes you to a very different place. And the other thing I want you to pay attention to is the birds. Because it turns out that when you have a title like Alone in America, you think of another set of images. You have a set of stock images in your mind already. And I think I know what they are. I want to show them to you later and see if you agree. The birds are not those images, so keep this in mind. What I want to do over the next 40 minutes or so is persuade you of two big ideas. The first is this one, and I'm not going to insult you by reading them to you. I'm guessing that you guys read slides. One of my pet peeves is people who come and give PowerPoint presentations and read you slides. You can do that on your own, but this is the first big idea. And this is the second one. It doesn't mean what we think. Now, I'm presuming you think something, and that might not be fair, but when I asked you if you had an image for Alone in America, I'm guessing it's one of either of the two images I'm about to show you. You might have thought of a guy like this, the kind of Lone Ranger, frontier character, an iconic figure in American culture. And you would have good reason. It turns out that until about the 1950s, living alone in the United States was most prevalent in the big, open, sprawling western states, places like Alaska and Wyoming and Montana. These were largely migrant working men. And in my fantasies, they look like this. They're Lone Ranger kinds of guys. But we're in New York City. And I trust that you're urbanists. And so when we in New York City think of what it is to live alone or to be alone, we oftentimes think of this image here. This is Ed Hopper's Nighthawks, a 1943 painting. And there are many things that could be said about this image. It's also one of the great icons of American culture. But what's typically said about it is this is a depiction of profound loneliness. And we can see it in many ways. If you look, for instance, at the man whose back is towards us, what's notable about him is that he's by himself, and it's night. Now, it's interesting to me. We actually don't see his face. He might look really happy. Actually, he might be having the time of his life there, but we project onto him this sense that he's off. He's having a bad night. He's by himself. And I want us to remember this idea too, that we tend to project a lot onto the image of the person who is alone. So he looks lonely, but in a way, and this is also important for our story, the people across from him look pretty lonely too. They are together, but they don't seem to be having a love connection. That something is off. And remember this idea. Now, 1943, it would make some sense to think of people who are alone as being off in some way. It was very unusual to live alone or even to be single. So what you're looking at here is just a simple bar chart of the proportion of American adults who were single in 1950, about 22%, and also the proportion of American households that had just one person, under 10%. Okay, this is 1950. So maybe that kind of atmosphere, the mood you get in the Hopper painting makes some sense given the time. You should know also that people's views about those who lived alone were in keeping with this kind of story. When some psychologists at the University of Michigan did a survey of Americans' attitudes towards people who lived alone and were single, they found that 80% of American adults thought that single people were either sick or neurotic or immoral if they wanted to be single. It was just a very weird thing to be doing then, and we were quite judgmental about it. I'm a social scientist, and let me say that my discipline has contributed to this idea. The best-selling books in the history of American sociology have titles like The Lonely Crowd, The Fall of Public Man, more recent titles that maybe you've seen. Bowling Alone. Do you remember this concept of bowling alone? Robert Putnam's great book from about 12 years ago. And more recently, Sherry Turkle, an MIT professor, wrote a book, Alone Together, about the ways in which technology, including social media, maybe especially social media, in her view, estrange us from one another. This has been a long-standing concern of American life. If any of you are subscribers to the Atlantic Monthly, you'll know that the current cover story asks the question, is Facebook making us lonely? And the author claims, in fact, that we are experiencing an epidemic of loneliness in the United States. We have never been lonelier or more atomized, he claims. We hear ideas like this quite often. About 6 years ago, a blockbuster study came out in the American Sociological Review, the kind of premier journal in my discipline, and it reported that we've never been more isolated. 1 in 4 Americans, it claimed, say that they have no confidant, no close friend, no one with whom they can discuss important, confidential, personal matters. And that was an incredible spike from 1985 when it was just under 1 in 10, in fact. So what really changed between 1984 and 1985 and 2004? Well, the internet. So a lot of people thought, well, maybe this is a story about the internet. This is a story we're used to telling ourselves. Let me also confess that my first book, this book about a heat wave in Chicago, was for many people powerful because it reported on hundreds of people dying alone in the city of Chicago. And the book is kind of thought to be in that tradition of, stories about how isolated and estranged we've become in the United States. So I've contributed to this concept myself, full disclosure. When I finished the reporting for Heatwave and the research for Heatwave, I decided I was going to do a bigger project on this issue of living alone and being alone in American cities. I thought something important was happening, and I expected that what was important was that we were getting estranged. I thought I would write the book I told you the title of, Alone in America. But the first thing I did is I pulled out of the story of Chicago, where principally the people I studied were older and frail and poor. And I wanted to see, who really does live alone in the United States. So I want to direct you for the moment towards the bottom of this chart, where you get the distribution of living alone by age. Now, this was a surprise to me. Okay, it turns out that today, about 32.7 million Americans live alone. Okay, that's up from the 4 million in 1950, 9% of all households. I thought they'd be mostly elderly, but the truth is about a third of people who live alone today are over the age of 65. And I'm reluctant even to call them elderly, because part of the story is that people are staying younger for longer and more active and engaged in the world as they hit their 60s and 70s. About half of the people who live alone in the United States today are middle-aged adults between the ages of 35 and 64. Typically, they have lived with someone else before. Generally, they have been married and they're now separated or divorced. But they're not the people I studied when I did the book about Chicago. And then, this was a surprise to me before I started, by far the fastest growing segment of Americans who live alone in the last several decades has been young adults under the age of 35. About 500,000 young adults lived alone in 1950 in the United States, and today more than 5 million do. They represent about 11% of all young adults. And so if you think about this change from 1950, it really is quite staggering. And this is what earns for me the first claim I gave you, that this is the biggest social change we haven't named or identified. Look at the dramatic spike in the number of people who are unmarried, single. Today it's about half of all adults. And then next to it, the proportion of households that have just one person. From 9% in 1950 to 28% today. This is a striking demographic shift, and one that has far-reaching implications. So I just want to give you a little bit more of the numbers. I'm guessing you'd be curious. You can see what this looks like in terms of the sheer population from 1960 to today. You can look at it at the proportion of households. Pretty similar slope. I told you that in 1950, living alone was most common in this big sprawling western states and rural areas. The Lone Ranger was our figure. Well, by today, it has become an overwhelmingly urban phenomenon, and not just one in the kind of fancy elite coastal cities. You might not be surprised that 42% of households are one-person households in Seattle, or 40% in San Francisco, near the mothership. But look at Denver and Minneapolis and Atlanta, all above 40%. Washington, D.C., 48%. Manhattan now, 46%. Almost 1 in every 2 households. So this is really it's really become something that we do in cities, and that's striking. What I want to do for the remainder of my talk is kind of move beyond these numbers, though, and get you kind of inside of the story of my research and tell you more about what I learned and what this means. The work for this project involved getting the numbers right up front, but then also doing hundreds of interviews with people who live alone in different cities around the United States, mainly cities in this research, and a little bit outside of the United States as well. And we did research with people who fall into the 3 different age groups I gave you before. And then also, and I won't talk about it much today, with a smaller sample of pretty poor men who live alone in hotel residences. It's a declining group in many respects, but numerically as well. One of the big conceptual changes for me in doing this book came from thinking about living alone as a social problem, which is what generally attracts the interest of sociologists, something that we perceive to be a problem in the world, to thinking about it as a social experiment, which is more unusual. And why did I see it that way? Well, one of the things I learned doing a lot of reading in history and anthropology is that until about the 1950s, you cannot find a single human society in the history of our species that sustained large numbers of people living alone for long periods of time. It literally does not exist. And this is a little passage from one of the classic books in anthropology, George Murdoch's book on social structure, where he makes the claim that the nuclear family is a universal. And he was challenged, but generally from people who said, what about the kibbutz, or what about this other more communal arrangement? No one challenged him and said, look at this society where large numbers of people organize their personal lives by living alone. It's a novel experience, and I think we misunderstand it if we see it only as a social problem. So how did it happen? How did we make this sudden break, this innovation in the way we organize our lives, and how should we think about it? Well, the first thing to say is it's expensive to live alone. And one reason that you see the spike in living alone after the 1950s is we have more widespread affluence. It's a tough thing to say in a moment like this when the economy is not doing so well, but the period after World War II is the beginning of a period of real affluence in many developed economies. Some of the wealth comes from the market economy. But much of the security that we've earned since then comes, too, from our contributions to the welfare state. And when you have Social Security and guaranteed health care and home care and public transportation and all the things that we now in some ways take for granted as part of the welfare state, it becomes much easier to live independently and get the kinds of services and support you need from institutions that are not the family sharing a home with you. And when you recognize that living alone is a feature of an affluent society, you flip the question from social problem to this one, right? Of all the ways that we could use our resources, why this? What does this say? This is not an easy question to answer, but it's important to ask the question in this way. Well, one of the things that's clear is that living alone comports with a number of our sacred modern values, right? It gives us a level of freedom to do what we want when we want to do it. It allows us to achieve a level of personal control that can be very difficult when we share space with another person. When we have that space, we have a chance for a level of self-realization. For young people, and I'll talk about this a little later, many of the younger adults who live alone say that they do it so that they can become adult. so that they have the time and space to think about who they are and the kind of life they want to live, the kind of person they want to become. Now that we marry later than ever before, which we do, the typical age of first marriage in the United States is about 29 for men and about 27 for women. It's by getting a place of their own that young adults have this experience of feeling like they are becoming themselves. And I'll say something else about this, which is that people who live alone longer and delay getting married, as opposed to getting married in their early 20s, are much more likely to marry successfully, to stay married, than people who race into it. So that's why I say living alone gives people not just the chance for solitude, this kind of productive solitude that probably all of us need in a hyper-networked age like the one we live in now, but also because living alone paradoxically gives us a chance to reconnect and to connect, and perhaps on a deeper level, with the kinds of people we're really looking for. Okay? In the book, I argue that there are 4 big drivers in the spike of living alone in addition to prosperity. The first is not Mary Tyler Moore, but it is the rising status of women in the world. You simply can't understand why that so many people live alone outside of this. When women enter into the paid labor force in mass beginning in the 1950s, they establish the economic independence to live longer without getting married, on their own. And they also give themselves a chance to get out of a bad relationship or marriage without sentencing themselves to a lifetime of poverty or forcing their family to take them in. It was actually quite common 60, 70, 80 years ago for a woman who, for whatever reason, lost her husband or separated her husband to move back in with her family. And when women become economically independent, they no longer have to do that. Of course, women also become more culturally independent in the post-war period as well, and gain a control over their own bodies that they didn't have before. The sexual revolution is part of this. You can't understand the spike in living alone outside of it. We know this. I'll just tell you one place where there's a lot of affluence, but almost no one lives alone, and that's Saudi Arabia. Right? In parts of the world where women don't have this level of independence, living alone is impossible. Now here we are at Google, and it would be silly for me not to emphasize that you can't really understand the rise of living alone outside of communications technologies. Now, admittedly, the spike in living alone starts earlier. You saw that on the charts I showed before. But it's not as if there was no communication technology there. When you have the telephone and the television set, then you can be home alone and also connected to ideas and people and information and entertainment in a way that was previously impossible. Now, think about what it means to live alone and be home alone when you have Skype and Facebook and Google Plus and instant messaging and Meetup and Craigslist and all the kinds of technologies that we have that connect us to each other. Right? It means that living alone and being home alone can be a profoundly social experience. And I want to make something clear here. We are at this moment, you remember that Facebook cover story, is Facebook making us lonely, that the Atlantic Monthly has right now. There's a lot of anxiety that social media have made us less connected, less deeply connected. But the best research in the social sciences we have tells us that the heaviest users of social media are also the heaviest users of face-to-face interaction. Heavy users of social media are actually more likely to spend time in public and to spend face time with friends and neighbors than the lighter users. Okay, so a lot of our anxiety is maybe about the quality of those connections or maybe about our distraction. There are lots of reasons to be concerned about where our attention is in a digital age. But there's no evidence that it's making us less connected to each other. I showed you that map of American cities that have high proportions of one-person households. That's also part of the big story here. You can't understand the rise of living alone outside of urbanization. Cities are places where people can live alone and be together with others who are like them. So if I tell you that in Manhattan, about 1 of every 2 households is a one-person household. As people who live here or at least come to work here every day, you know that there are certain neighborhoods where there are far more single people and people who live alone than others. So in places like Chelsea and the West Village and Midtown, 60–70% of the households are one-person households. And I bet if I say the names of Los Angeles or Chicago or Seattle or San Francisco or Boston to you, you know precisely which neighborhoods in those cities are concentrations, are places where people who live alone are concentrated. And of course, people who are single or live alone, and I make a distinction between the two, they are different things, they are attracted to those places. So cities have become places that have transformed the experience of being alone. And moreover, and I wrote an article for Fortune magazine about this recently, I don't think you can understand the renaissance of public life in cities and in urban economies outside of the rise of single people and people who live alone inside of them, because they're very active. There's also a myth about people who live alone, that they are isolated and more lonely, right? The people in the Edward Hopper paintings. But another thing I learned writing this book is that on average, people who live alone are actually more likely to spend time with friends and with neighbors than people who are married. It's not going to surprise you to learn that they're more likely to go out at night and spend time and money in bars and restaurants and cafes. I'm not going to win a Nobel Prize for that discovery. But they're also more likely to volunteer in civic organizations on average than people who are married. And that really was a surprise to me, right? We have a story we tell ourselves about the way in which married people and families are the bedrocks of community life. And that's true in some respects, but it's not true in all respects. And of course, the people specifically who do more time with friends and neighbors and who contribute more to civic organizations when they're single and living alone are women. Because married women, when they have children especially, just don't have the time and the energy to contribute to public life in the same way. They're generally saddled with more domestic responsibilities. Not to demean that. And I should be really clear. I'm not here to persuade you to go home and leave your wife or your husband. This is not the case to live alone. It would be hypocritical of me to do that. I'm married myself. I have 2 young kids. But this is something that we need to understand. And I think we need to re-examine our attitudes and kind of premises about what it means to live alone and what people who live alone do. Now, the fourth generator of the spike in living alone is the longevity revolution. Today we live longer than ever before, but we live unevenly. You can't know with certainty that you and your spouse will live together and die the same day or week or year. And in fact, it has now become quite common for women who tend to outlive men to outlive their spouse by 2 or 5 or 10 or in some cases 20 or 25 years. And you can probably think of people in your friendship circle or your family who have lived alone for long periods of time at this stage of life, right? And this is where the Ed Hopper paintings really become resonant again. When you're old, you're more at risk of getting isolated and withdrawn. That's why so many older people died alone in the heat wave. Now, I have to tell you that I was amazed to learn that from the best survey research that older Americans, too, are more likely to spend time with friends and neighbors if they live alone than they are if they're married. I really didn't expect that. So we shouldn't think that universally they're isolated and lonely, but there is a risk here. And there's a gendered risk as well, I should say. Women are far more likely to age alone, but they're also better at staying connected to friends and family than men. So they tend to be less isolated, whereas men who live alone, especially men who age alone, tend to fare worse. I put this slide up here because maybe that will change. Maybe the way that we connect with each other provides opportunities for everyone who lives alone to establish relationships and to be together in new ways. We know all the ways in which young people use social media to make ties and to organize face-to-face time as well. You surely know that increasingly older people are getting online and using social media in the same ways, right? So maybe if you have children, your children talk to their grandparents, with Skype, mine do. And that's a big change. But there are other ways in which older people are connecting with each other and with other neighbors, with people they don't know, through dating sites, through friendship sites, through things like Meetup online as well. So there's a whole arena in which social media and communications technologies become really important to thinking about how we will live together now that we're living alone. I don't mean to be telling you in this, talk today that we shouldn't be worried about loneliness. Obviously, many people who live alone suffer from loneliness, and it can be difficult to be alone and live alone and get lonely because it can quickly cycle into a vicious cycle, right? Each one feeds the other. But let's be realistic about loneliness and what it means in the human condition as well. Because this is something that people told me over and over again in my interviews. Right? That people worry about us when we live alone, but they also say that there's nothing lonelier than being in the wrong relationship. It means something to feel lonely when you're sitting at home in your apartment. It means you get a cue physiologically, emotionally, to get out into the world and engage with other people. But if you're lying next to your spouse and you feel lonely, that's a really powerful cue. And it's not quite clear what you can do with that. It's profound and intense. Remember that study I showed you in the beginning of the talk, the 1 in 4 Americans have no confidant? I put this up, with the image, because the image is from the USA Today, and when that study came out in 2006, it got enormous amounts of attention. It's as if we have an appetite to be told that we're really isolated from each other. The authors were on every TV show imaginable that got amazing coverage in the USA Today and the New York Times. Well, it turns out the data were flawed. Many of us suspected this at the time. Not that it was easy for us to get airtime on those TV shows, reporting that, we don't have friends anymore. But now the data has been really heavily scrutinized. And the guy who's now a professor at Cornell, who was the grad student who crunched the numbers, you guys know about grad students who crunch numbers here. He's what now publicly said, this is not reliable. And it isn't. We're not more isolated than ever before. We're just about as isolated as we always have been. We're not more lonely than we've ever been before. I took on the Facebook cover story in an article in Slate. We're about as lonely as we have been. Right? Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned about some things. There's lots of reasons to make our lives better and to strive for more connection and less loneliness, but let's not panic. Let's not panic about this. I told you before that my book was going to be called Alone in America, and I've now spent about 40 minutes telling you why the alone part of the book title was wrong. That was a really bad idea. People who live alone are not so alone. This slide tells you how bad the In America part of my title was. I really thought this was going to be a thing about, American individualism and our culture of, self-reliance, right? Emerson and Thoreau and the Lone Ranger and the whole thing, and that turns out to just be wrong. Or to the extent that Americans have those kinds of cultural attitudes, we're just like people in many other countries, including Japan, Canada, the Scandinavian nations, most of Europe. What's striking is, in fact, the places on Earth that have the highest proportions of people who live alone are the Scandinavian countries, which make the greatest contributions to the welfare state. Right? And what I came away understanding, which I really didn't know when I started the project, is that it's by contributing to the common good and to these commonly shared resources that we give ourselves the capacity to live the way that feels best, which is to say that it's our interdependence that makes our independence possible. Right? It's our interdependence that makes our independence possible. That's why living alone is so much higher in countries with generous welfare states. It's also why living alone is so much higher in cities than it is in rural areas. Now, very few people aspire to live alone. Most Americans, most people will get married at some point in their lives. My point is not, this is what we want most in life. But what's different about us today is we recognize that if we can't find the relationship that works for us, we can live alone and be pretty social. We can live alone and be better than we thought we would be. Even better than, our aunt or, our grandmother or our friends think we're going to be. Because remember that guy in the Hopper painting whose back is to us and we project our feelings onto him? Well, it turns out we often do this with people we know in our own lives who are single and aren't married. The first thing we talk to them about is whether they've met someone and can we fix them up. And sometimes that's the right thing to do, but sometimes it's not. So I hope you understand, now why Going Solo and Not Alone in America is the title for this book. And I hope you see that, the birds take you someplace where, the Ed Hopper paintings don't. And, maybe when the paperback comes out, we'll come up with a human image that, suits this story. But I hope that over lunch today I've at least given you something to think about. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. So I think we have some time for questions.
You said that basically that the level of dysfunction is essentially constant in the society. Has it moved around? I mean, if the most you seem to say that the most functional people actually are probably getting better. Are the least functional people getting worse?
That's a good question. To be honest, I don't have the data to really answer that question, but I do think that we are providing less to people who have the most trouble, and this is worrisome. So, for instance, when there's an economic crisis and cities lose their funding to do a bunch of different programs, they often do things like cut the budget for senior care or for specialized transportation. Maybe you followed this debate in New York City the last several years. I write about it in the book, where the city is actually quite generous with programs for older people and older people who live alone. And one of the great programs the city has maintained over the years has been a Meals on Wheels program. You get a hot meal delivered to your door every day if you're in need. Well, when times got tough and the agencies lost funding, they said, we got to economize. And one really nice way to do that is to deliver more meals, per visit. So rather than a live human being coming to knock on your door and hand you a meal and provide a little company every day, you might get 6 frozen meals twice a week. Now that's a cold policy, and I'm not talking about the food. It's a policy that fails to register the way in which the interaction is part of what you're giving when you give a meal. That's happening in an affluent city like New York City. Cities around the country are cutting far more than that. And so I worry that people who live alone and are really vulnerable and isolated are getting more vulnerable and more isolated. That really was the story of the heat wave in Chicago. It's an invisible world in some respects. One guy I spoke with called this a secret society of people who live and die alone. We certainly don't see it in our everyday lives, but it's a real world, and one I think we should be concerned about. One of the things that I'm trying to think out now is, what are the implications of the aging of the boomer generation for aging alone? We are going to have record numbers of people who are old and living alone. Many of them had their savings, clipped quite a lot by the recession and the crash in the stock market in 2008. And I fear that we haven't figured out a way to provide the kind of care and support to older people who are alone that we really need to do. And in my family, my grandmother who died recently needed to be in an assisted living facility, and she was fortunate enough to have, 3 children who could help to take care of her and support her, but it was incredibly expensive, and she lived that way for a long time, more than a decade, and there are not a lot of families that can sustain that. So I think we'll collectively need to find some way to deal with this housing issue for older people, for sure. Yeah.
I'll throw out a couple of comments and questions. There seems to me that there's an underlying subtext here, in your talk at least, I haven't read your book, that alone is wrong, that alone is bad. And, you seem to be a little surprised that that's not always the case. And, it seems to me that's perhaps a reflection of a classic sort of approach of an extrovert to people who are more introverted, that not everyone finds spending, the most productive they can be or the most happy they can be is spending, is being out in a bar at a party with a lot of people and talking. I mean, a lot of us find, well, I don't know about a lot of us, the world, but certainly a lot of us Google engineers, a ridiculously large percentage of Google engineers find exactly the opposite, that there's a real value to being alone or solo, at least some of the time.
Yeah.
And specifically, to point out one thing you sort of threw out there, I think you made a comment, if I heard you correctly, that you don't win Nobel Prizes by going out to bars.
No, that my claim to you that people who live alone tend to go out more was not going to win me a Nobel Prize.
Oh, I'm sorry. Then I completely misunderstood that claim. So.
Neither of us gets a Nobel today.
Okay.
But next week.
Okay.
But can I say something about this? Because I think what you've hit on is what is totally right. But what I hope came across today, and what I learned in the book is my prior was that people who live alone, whether they're introverted or not, were less connected, and that this was something we needed to really worry about because they could get dangerously isolated, and they were lonely people, and they were miserable living alone. I shared in that quite widespread, view. And what I learned in the course of doing this work is I think your prior. Some of us need to learn a lot before we get someone else's prior, which is that in fact, for many people, living alone, being alone, spending time alone works out pretty well, much better than we conventionally think. That's why I think we need to break away from the concept that this is a social problem only, and also recognize it as a social experiment. Now, there is a difference between being alone and spending a lot of work time alone. I'm a writer. Most writers have the same thing as the Google engineers. We need to have our time with our machine. But that's different from living alone. And what's really interesting to me, sociologically, anthropologically, historically, is that we never did this before. We are involved in an experiment that really is unprecedented. And I think, my book might be the first on this social experiment, but surely there will be more, because this is a whole-scale re-engineering of what it means to organize your life, your home. We don't have stories to tell about it. There's not a great, there's not received wisdom from centuries. There's the hermetic, the tradition of hermits and monks, but there's not much that understands what it means to live alone in an urban environment. And the book is really my first cut at this, but I think this is something we'll be mulling over for a long time. And I think that people in places like Google will be playing a role in this, because a lot of what shapes the quality of your experience is your interaction with screens and with the social life that digital culture affords. I hope you share that view. Yeah.
If this trend of people living alone goes on for a long time, what are the long-term implications of that would be on the society at a larger scale? For example, I consider families as a type of a social safety net that's more reliable than, let's say, your mutual fund.
Yeah. So there are many questions to consider here. Recall that in Scandinavia, where living alone is far more advanced than it is here. In Stockholm, for instance, about 60% of the households are one-person households. It's 47% of households at the national level in Sweden are one-person households. So we can see a little bit of our future in Scandinavia, but that's if we sustained social programs and support services and a welfare state to the level that they do there. And that seems unlikely at a moment like this. It even seems unlikely there. So that's to say that you can sustain living alone as an experience and also sustain good health and longevity if you make the commitment to the public institutions that can do that. I'd say that's what we can learn from the Scandinavians. If you don't do that, and you kind of privatize it and marketize it, then you run the risk of real isolation, because those who can't sustain themselves will fall through the cracks. For my money, the real question about sustainability has to do with the environment. What does it mean to have so many people with their own individual, kitchens and other appliances and homes? Now, we don't have enough research to really answer that question. So it's not at all clear to me that the carbon footprint of 4 single people living in small, energy-efficient Manhattan apartments who use public transportation to get to work is any bigger than the carbon footprint of the family of 4 in a Westchester 3,000 square foot home with 2 cars and long commutes. What's the right comparison to answer this kind of question? I don't know. Because living alone is an urban experience mostly these days, and because cities are places where we can really build a more ecologically sustainable future, I don't think it's definitely going to be a problem, but I think this is something we really need to watch and develop. Yeah.
Hey, going back to the introvert point, I'm not sure if introverts have anything to do with this, but did you find in your research that any specific personality traits tend to much more willingly want to live alone than others, or is it sort of like equal opportunity for all sorts of circumstances in life?
Yeah. So I have to say that I'm not being a psychologist. I wasn't asking questions about personality types. So what I have to say next reflects my kind of off-the-cuff thinking rather than careful systematic observation. Clearly, people who are prone to depression and feelings of loneliness struggle more when they're on their own than others. And there is, this, vicious circle, or vicious cycle, where the loneliness feeds the depression, which, leads to, withdrawing from social life, which makes you more lonely and depressed. And that can be a real problem. If you have that set of personality characteristics and you know that, then living alone will be a challenge. Living alone requires, learning and developing a specific set of skills. And one of those skills is the skill to get yourself out into the world when it feels like the world isn't making a place for you. One woman I interviewed talked about getting her own place after living with roommates. This is like the real sign of success and distinction in a city, right? You move to Manhattan after school and you get your first job and you live with roommates, but then you can't stand your roommates after a while, so you get your own place, and that means you really made it. And then she said, so I got my own place and I was so excited, and I kept thinking this was going to be like college, where the phone would ring or someone would come knocking on the door and say, hey, come on, we're all going out. But that doesn't happen. So you have to figure out a way to project yourself into the world. And if you know you can't do that, you either have to learn that skill, and she did, or you have to look for some other kind of arrangement. I think it's notable too, this is not a psychological trait so much as a social one, that men tend to fare worse when they're living alone. Women, not universally, but on average, just have better skills at making and maintaining relationships. That's with their family members and also with their friends, and it's true over the life course. maybe with social media, men of younger generations are learning new skills to connect with each other. Maybe social media will provide that. I don't know. I think it's too early to tell. I'm trying to look more carefully at it. But clearly, living alone is not for everyone. Yeah, sorry.
Just wondering, I know you opened with that quote about how in the 50s people thought of people living alone as immoral and neurotic. Did you find any research on how people view people living alone today?
It's a great question, and basically, our attitudes have changed so much that social scientists don't even ask the question. When you live in a moment where half the adult population is single, and a third of them live alone, asking those questions just feels funny. Someone should. I went back to the people who did the survey, and then to a lot of the people who do survey research on attitudes towards marriage, and I tried to get this data, and I couldn't do it. Maybe someone will. All right, well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed speaking with you.